Good afternoon. Welcome to you all to this service of farewell for David, a dearly loved partner, father and grandfather, brother, uncle, friend and colleague to many. Your presence here is a great comfort to the family and is deeply appreciated. I'm Barbara Harvey, conducting the proceedings. The family wish to record their thanks to all the medical staff of Ward 5 and the High Dependency Unit at North Shore Hospital, who worked so hard to try and save David's life. He was very grateful and he said so. In the end, the stakes were just too high. Thanks also to the specialists, John Matthews, Fergus Oliver and Peter Fong, who have cared for him over the past 18 years. And of course, David's GP, the outstanding Alison Copeland, to whom the family are deeply indebted. David died at dawn last Thursday, 26th of April, peacefully with Julie and family present. He was in his 78th year. He had been on his bike only 3 weeks before and the boat a month ago. So in the words of Dylan Thomas, do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. David would have liked the opportunity of one more joke, one more chance to air his iconoclastic views, give some more cheek. Sadly, it was not to be. We are all here because we want to honour David and celebrate his rich, eventful life. When talking with Julie and the family on Saturday, the house was brimming over with a never-ending stream of visitors. Stories kept tumbling out, many and varied as befits the man. David was, as stated in the Herald Notice, a sailor, a teacher, an adventurer, a writer, an award-winning architect, holder of the New Zealand Institute of Architects Gold Medal, a rock and roller, a fervent Elvis fan, a raconteur. He had great mana and presence. He loved a battle. He would take on anybody. He was a man ahead of his time, an intellectual giant without any hint of snobbery or elitism. I remember the opening of Te Uru, David and Julie's great project in Titirangi. The so-called dignitaries were seated up on the front, boring the pants off everybody, as David would say. David was standing down at the back, and he was not in great shape at that time, I remember. It was only when I insisted that he agreed to take his rightful place and seated on the podium. So I'm going to talk a bit about David's life and just give an outline, and the others will colour in with their own tributes. David John Mitchell was born 8th of March 1941, the first child of Leonella and John. He was followed by his dear sisters Judy and Linda. The family lived in Morrinsville, where John taught at the high school. David attended Hamilton Boys High before studying architecture at Auckland. At the tender age of 20, David married Judith Lowry, and the children, Ben, Tessa and Julie made their appearance. Julian's mother, Irene, and her sister, Bridget, joined them in their crumbling cottage at Hepburn Street, which was not fashionable then. Life must have been chaotic, with David completing his degree and then starting work. His first job was Fletcher's, before being invited to work with John Goldwater on the Grays Avenue Synagogue. Later at Thorpe Cutter & Co, he worked on the Auckland Teachers College with Jack Manning. This led to the setting up of Hill Manning Mitchell with Jack and Peter Hill. The Auckland Music School remains a glowing testament to that partnership. David took on the teaching at Auckland University and the heady days of the brick studio began. His abiding interest in the architecture of this country led to the writing of Elegant Sheds in conjunction with Gillian Chaplin, who took the photographs. In 1981, David met Julie Stout, his partner in life and work for 37 years. And in 1990, they formed Mitchell Stout Architects, and the rest, as they say, is history. In 1991, when he was 50, declaring, "I could be dead soon," David decided to sail the world. They set off in the Rogue 36-footer, arriving in Hong Kong a year later, where they both worked while living on the boat. In 94, they were lured back to Auckland and left Rogue behind in Hong Kong to work with Jenny and Alan Gibbs and Alexa Johnson on the conversion of the old Telecom building into the new Contemporary Art Gallery. In 1996, they resumed their sailing life, and going via the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. I don't know whether it was that trip. There was a very alarming pirate story which David relished telling. Of course, they survived it. Whilst in Turkey, it was discovered that David had early signs of prostate cancer. Please turn that off. He left Rogue in the Med and returned to New Zealand at the start of the new millennium and a new chapter in life. He re-established a practice in the central city, They re-established a practice in the central city, joined by David's son Julian and Ginny Pedlow in partnership. Rogue was sold, compadre bought, and shared with Trish and John Gribben. Grandchildren started arriving. Julie's mother needed help. A new house was required to accommodate the expanding family when needed. So the unique, outstanding and controversial house at Narrow Neck, it showed a whole new direction in domestic architecture. To quote from Simon Wilson's piece in yesterday's Herald, David said, "I'm not really concerned about whether people like it or not, because there are a lot of their houses that I don't like." And I can just hear him saying that with his wry grin. David spent his last decade doing everything he loved, which is not a bad way to go. Working, trips overseas with friends, reading, gardening. As you know, David and Julie have a stunning garden, sailing with his beloved grandchildren. So the words of another sailor king, Ulysses, by Alfred Tennyson. "Though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield." So we're going to have some family tributes now. First, Jude and Linda.
Kia ora tātou. Hi everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about my very favourite big brother David and some of the things I remember about him in the days when we were growing up in Morrinsville. He was very talented. At school he was really good at art. He was in the school cricket team. He made very funny speeches in the speech competitions, and he was an excellent violin student. Actually, his friends thought that playing the fiddle was the strange thing about Mitchell. And he was humble about it all. I have never ever heard him skite about any of the things he did well. And David was kind. He was always warm and generous-hearted. And as a personal example, when we were kids, I was horse mad and finally got a little Kaimanawa Brumby, which was always falling off. When I was learning to control him, David always came with me on his bike to see that I was okay. It must have been extremely boring for him, and he was definitely not keen on horses, but he never complained about it. Even in those days, he was pretty adventurous. Lots of kids climbed the big chestnut tree in the recreation ground next to our house, but he was the only one who dared climb right to the top of it. That was pretty daring, but not sure about intelligent. Not sure about that bit. And here are a couple of stories I promised never to tell Mum and Dad. He used to roam around with a bunch of mates, and I do remember two of them, Boonsey and Valsey. The creek was a favourite place. One day they decided to take a wooden apple box down to the creek, to the bridge over the creek. David drew up an exciting plan. Because the box couldn't possibly float, they tied some long rope to each end of it, and they lowered it down over the bridge. David stood on the bank, one side of the creek, and his mate on the other, holding their bit of rope with the box between them and the creek. The idea was that someone got into the box to be towed over the water from one bank to the other. So the first boy climbed into the box next to David, but the boy on the far side wasn't strong enough to pull the rope across, and he let it go when it was halfway across the river. And of course the box was anything but waterproof, and the kid in the creek couldn't swim, and he nearly drowned. But finally they hauled him to the bank, clinging to the rope and the box. And that plan of David's was not successful. And then there's the railroad story. Kids used to hang out around the railway station because it was fun seeing the trains come and go with all the cattle and the sheep being loaded and unloaded for the farmers. There was a railway bridge near the station. David and his friends all hung out under the bridge there because they found that it had a plank missing. When a train came past, they would dare one another to put their finger up above the bridge. After a while, they got braver and stuck a hand up. And then one day, Boonsey said he would put his head up and look around under the train. Anyhow, the train came along and Boonsey stuck his head up just in time to see the cow catcher right in front of him. He dived down and he missed it by an inch. I now realise why I had to keep it all a secret from Mum and Dad. And David, as we all know, was always very, very witty. And boy, could he rock and roll. Luminous socks, slicked back hair, just like Elvis Presley. And David, at that stage, when we were in Morrinsville, was going to be a geologist. He had a collection of rocks that filled our old chook house. But then in 1958, after we'd left Morrinsville, he heard a talk by the architectural historian Nicholas Pevsner, which changed the course of his personal history. David was warm-hearted, humble, generous, adventurous, witty, and an original thinker. And I shall miss him very much. And now I'll pass over to Louise.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings, everybody. My dear, lovely brother David. As his younger sister, I loved and admired him through all our childhood and through all his life. I was always so proud to be his sister. David had an inner kindness, a generosity of spirit, intelligence and amazing wit. He was very funny. He was fearless and courageous. He loved his family and friends very deeply. He always asked me after my children and grandchildren. He included and talked to them. He admired, he was proud of their interests, and he was optimistic about their lives. We lived in Morrinsville throughout David's primary schooling to the sixth form. We started in a 2-bedroom state house in Thorpe Street where David had to sleep in Mum and Dad's bed, later to be carried out to the divan in the sitting room. Judy and I shared a bedroom. This was the 50s and girls and boys weren't allowed to sleep in the same bedroom. Later we moved round the corner to 34 Anzac Avenue with 3 bedrooms next to the recreation ground, the Rec, with its grandstand, chestnut tree and trick bar. That was our playground. And the Forbidden River Walk, which you've already heard about, beside the Piako River. David did acts of daring that astonished and enthralled me, and he encouraged us to do things too. We ran behind the little 2-seater top-dressing plane as it took off in the Rec for the thrill of the wind in our face and the rage of the pilot. David put Judy and me up to trying to fly from the grandstand with homemade wings. We believed him that anything was possible. He told us about his adventures, putting pennies on the railway line, hoping to derail the train as it steamed by, hiding in the bushes and watching. It didn't happen, but the flattened pennies were a coveted trophy. Our house was quite a plain little state house, but inside lots of interesting things happened. The community arts service came to Morrinsville a few times each year, and each time we billeted musicians and actors and went to their performances. David played a key role in the visit of some famous recorder players and a harpsichordist who were billeted with us. On the afternoon of their concert, the guests didn't come home to get ready, and we didn't know where they were. David had the idea to go out on his bike to look for their distinctive car in Morrinsville's main street, and he found it parked outside the Nottingham Castle Hotel. One of the recorder players was too drunk to stand up. So much plotting happened about how to cover up and what were we going to do. Mum and Dad ended up locking the recorder player in our Ford Prefect while the concert went on -1. So music and drama were a big part of our lives. We listened to music, we went to music concerts, we all played instruments. David became a very good violinist. And in the sitting room at night, Mum and Dad practiced their lines for their parts in plays for the Morrinsville Dramatic Society. So I remember Love in the Ape House and Death of a Salesman. We listened in, we knew the lines off by heart, we took parts in the practice. David was also a very talented painter and drawer, and I'm sure his love of arts and creativity started here in Morrinsville. David didn't like pretentiousness, he wasn't mean, he wasn't judgmental. Instead, he had a wonderful irreverence. Despite his amazing achievements, he was never a show-off, always generous with his thoughts and ideas. I miss him. Take heart and good memories, dear friends.
John Hancock.
Thank you, Barbara. That's better, thanks. Great. Hello, I'm John Hancock. David's family and Julie have asked me to some recollections from David when he came to Hamilton Boys High School in 1957 for his last 2 years. He arrived from Morrinsville, seen as the cowshed to Hamiltonian civilization. But despite his unprepossessing origin, he came fully formed with all the attributes of his future self. When I look at a photo of him in the 57 class photo, he looks somewhat gawky, if not goofy. But this was not so in the live, for he had style, but not the style smeared on like Brill cream favoured by the school's wide boys, but a style and a panache of someone who had felt comfortable in his shoes, with a confidence and purpose to use their cultural wherewithal to take on provincial New Zealand. His native wit was embellished by an unusually fine diction, which was in part a product of his stern schoolteacher, Father John, who made David practice public speaking, learn and declaim reams of poetry and other writing. The dominant culture of Hamilton in those days was rugby, and then, of course, there was also rugby. For it was in the days of Mulu and the Clark brothers, who are also Morrinsville alumni. However, David came with a knowledge and practice of a wider culture outside of provincial Waikato. He had read prose and poetry over the needs of school English, and he talked of art and architecture, which was unheard of those days. He excelled at playing the classical violin, and while he did not parade his abilities, he was often to be found in front of school with Howard Smith doing skite fiddling, no doubt trying to emulate Fritz Kreisler. This consisted of extravagant chords, pizzicato, and flagrant bowing, but very little else. All unnoticed by the boys sloshing around in the rugger mud. He came armed with purpose. For while most of us had an idea of a career, Dave came with a passion for and to do architecture, which was not high on the usual list of career options. His passion was such that when Nicholas Pevsner, the great British architect and historian and critic, came to lecture in the 6x6 brick box that was the then Hamilton Arts Centre, he persuaded me to go with him, and thereby both of us missing the school ball. But afterwards, biking home in the foggy river town night, we felt a slight sense of satisfaction, if not exultation, at having succeeded in the battle of the mind over the matter of the ball and girls. Despite his civilised trappings, he mixed well at school and was readily accepted as one of the boys. He did well in English, especially with his elegantly written essays, and bravely took on mechanics or applied maths with the bright boys, and ruefully talked of his difficulties in that class. This revealing a charming trait of his, that of using his weakness or fear to be made light of or to raise a laugh. This putting himself on the edge was to be seen in later years in his design and adventuring. I remember one early close shave with David when, with a madcap friend of his from Morrinsville, who knew of a little-known cave system on a farm near Waitomo, we squeezed into this system through a right-angled bend, very tight, and by 50 or 60 yards, way above on a gallery with a stream roaring below, we found ourselves with only one light. All the others had packed up. We got out by the combination of sheer good luck and David's nervous joking. It was always... In his classical music, he learned from a wonderful Swiss violinist, Hedy Bieland, who he revered. He played with the Hamilton String Orchestra and had a go at competition playing. He joined the school orchestra and adult education chamber music groups. He also played sports, doing okay in the second 15 and second 11, but his tennis was indifferent. And when he joined the Cathedral Tennis Club, it was more to hopefully effect a meeting with girls, but the resulting love match was that of tennis, not with the opposite sex. Not unexpectedly, girls were a serious consideration, but despite endless theorising, if not fantasising, the best that could be eked out was sometimes to check out the Dyer girls playing hockey behind a hurricane fence at their school. We lived along the same, in the same direction from school, and over the 6 or 7 kilometres, we argued furiously. I remember at first thinking him very arrogant, but came to realise that he won over it was his superb native intellect that won over my second-hand eclectic ideas. The arguments about finessing of taste or aesthetic judgment were never, ever to be won by me. It was always his recording of Yehudi Menuhin, playing the Beethoven violin concerto or the Bach partita that won over my Wolfgang Schneiderhan or whoever I was proposing. I sometimes enjoyed, despite his having a rich load of small town stories from Morrinsville, he happily turned his back on both places, for he is not given to sentimentality or nostalgia, because for him there was no option but to look forward and to go forward. So in those 2 years, it was clear that he was fitted out for his future life with an understanding that culture was an act of living, that design was for living, and that he had an intellect that was his own, not beholden to fashion, fads, or academia, and that he took risks, walking on the edge, and if it crumbled a bit, laughter was a consequence. Thank you.
Judy Lowry.
Greetings, everybody. I brought Amalia with me for a bit of moral support. And when I was making up these notes, guess who I missed in putting the cutting and pasting together? You know who. I remember David's family from even before they went in the early days to live in Morrinsville. John Mitchell and my dad, Bob Lowry, had met at Teachers College, I think just after the war. Leonelle had the most brilliant warmth and sense of humour. She had a smile that was like a piece of freshly cut watermelon. And she was a talented teacher. John was stern, as I recall, but absolutely loved his kids too, and he was ambitious for them. David told me a story, but the girls don't remember it, but he said that he can remember his dad putting a painting up and asking David to analyse it, criticise it, compare and contrast it with something else. And I thought that was a good strategy, but it seemed like a bit of a wank to me. On reflection, I think that the Waikato is a unique place. It's got a stable environment, and I think it was a perfect springboard for a highly intelligent young man to arrive in Auckland in the late 1950s, ready to start making his mark on New Zealand. He had it all, David. He had warmth, generosity of spirit, and an ability to use his lovely voice, especially when arguing a case. No wonder I got swept off my feet. He could quote verses from all the best romantic poets. He'd come up with whole stanzas of T.S. Eliot and A.R.D. Fairbairn. I was so impressed. And he could dance like a dream. Later, when rock and roll was happening, and it probably was happening even before that, he'd be throwing me over his shoulder and under his legs. We were both students and penniless, so we'd either ride on my Lambretta everywhere or we'd catch the Baruna and spend hours travelling backwards and forwards across the harbour on one fare. Right, David quickly settled in Auckland, and after his one disastrous D grade, started doing well at the School of Architecture. Luckily, he had inspirational lecturers such as Bill Wilson, Vernon Brown, Amy Porsolt, Peter Middleton, and Professor someone Marshall, I've forgotten his other name, but that's just to name some of them. He was always telling me about group architects, John Scott, Ernst Plisk, and Afield Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright. My family all got on incredibly well with David. They adored him. The Hayes, Vanya and Tom, my sister Bridgie, but Bob was one of David's important early influences, I think. And David loved being part of the Lowry party scene. He flourished. My dad took a fancy to David and was really fond, especially when David came to help out with a night after night printing job for the University Student Union. And luckily they got it done, but I think Dad owed him a few favours after that. Later, when we began house hunting, we decided to get a house and David chose it. It was in Freeman's Bay. So I think the one family member who wasn't so enchanted with David was my grandmother. She'd agreed to give us a mortgage, a second mortgage. And when she came to see the house, it was ramshackle, a workingman's cottage in the slums, according to my grandmother. So she withdrew her offer for a mortgage. I don't think David ever forgave her fully for that, but he knew how good a property it was. He knew it was going to be a loved and discovered favoured location, prime location in Auckland. We loved that house. We had neighbours. We had the Smythes, the Cooks, Marsh Cook and Nigel Cook family. There were the who else was there? There was Frank Lowe and the Tess, I've forgotten the other name. Forgive me, please. When the council made us sell, we went to live in Mount Eden, and it was then a very happening place. Some of our locals were the Hanleys, the Hoopers, the Bowsers, the Elys, the Leathams, Dean Hancock, Joss Wary, and many other interesting people. David's best invention there was a huge flying fox that he put up at the back of the garden, and it was a huge hit with the kids and with me. And also the neighbours, rather. David was a lovable husband and father for our 3 kids. In retrospect, I was the luckiest young woman alive to be married to him. He knew how to foster those kids, how to bring out the best in Ben, Tess and Julian, help them go on to make really interesting careers. During the 60s and early 70s, we spent time at the family land near Stillwater, also known as the Wade. There, David's vision, energy and enormous practical skills were really useful and much appreciated. He transformed one whole building, and then with some architecture students, Terry St George, Kia Volkeling, Shelley Lodge, my sister, a tower block was erected within 2 or 3 weeks over the summer. They were very labour intensive, and the kids all pitched in as well. I think I made cups of tea. But then in the 1970s, David was ready to move to another stage in his life and career. And jumping on, after the grandchildren was born, I admired so much the way David was with his 5 grandchildren. However, he couldn't have done so much for them and with them without Julie's skillful organisational skills and support. So, for our family, not only did David bring fun, adventure and a sense of fulfilment to all our lives, he also would have made John and Lionel so tremendously proud of his numerous wide-ranging achievements. So rest easy, David. You've earned that rest. We're all going to miss you. We all loved you. Thank you.
I mean, he wasn't perfect. And I know a lot of people have good dads, but our dad was a real ripper. He was great when we were kids. I mean, he was great with kids. He loved being a big kid. He was like always entertaining, and we'd get him to tell the same stories over and over again because we loved hearing him. We loved hearing his voice. And he loved telling them. The other thing that stood out was his adventuring. He would take us on adventures. It was kind of like the way he lived life. He was an inspiration in that way. He'd take us on these adventures, and when we had grandchildren, well, we had his grandchildren, he did the same with them. They all loved each other, and he'd take them on all sorts of adventures. Sometimes it was little things like going olive picking. Actually, he was meant to be going olive picking them the day he went into hospital. And there was sailing, of course. I wasn't so keen on sailing, except for the stopping bits where you got to sort of dive off the boat. In the 70s, when I was a kid, it was the perfect time for Dad. It was sort of like his personality. We used to talk about that, he and I. Just the fact that it was about liberation and flamboyance and being experimental. He got the Whole Earth catalogues, you know, those Whole Earth catalogues that were about different building and structures and the towers, domes and things. Mum and Dad bought a share on the Moeho community at the end of the Coromandel Peninsula. I think Sue and Roger Donaldson might have been the connection there. Anyway, we went on a travelling roadshow called Momba, and there's a few people here today that will remember Momba. It was a whole summer, and Dad played the fast fiddle. He played the fiddle in the band. I think it was called the Aerial Railway Band, and he also played the role of the Moeho Magic Mountain Monster. Us kids would sit right at the front every night, and we'd get really excited and scared as Dad walked through from the back of the audience as pretending to pick up sheep and devouring them. one night in the 70s, our dad got sabbatical for 2 years. After working there for 2 months, he was going to take us around America. And so he said to us, okay, we're going to take you kids to the States, but we also want to go somewhere else. We could either go to Canada or Mexico. And us kids said, oh, well, what's Canada like, Dad? And he told us. And then we said, well, what's Mexico like, Dad? And he told us. And we all said, Canada. And he said, I think we're going to go to Mexico. And we did. And it was amazing. It was the best thing we could do. He went round looking at Frank Lloyd Wright, of course. And us kids had a great adventure, or all of us as a family. We drove around in a Plymouth station wagon with the classic veneer panelling, which Dad loved. What else happened? Oh, I know what. The last little bit I was going to say was that I was a pretty messy teenager, as lots of my brothers were as well. They're not getting away with it. And Dad was always pretty much there for me. Whether it was dragging me out of some seedy party or saving me from some sleazy guy, or the other night, once ending up at the cop shop with my cousin, and he came to pick us up the next morning. And I thought, God, he's really making us pay that he hasn't come and got us the night before. But he confessed to me later. He said, Chippy, I'm sorry I didn't get you the other night. I was just too over the limit to drive. So you've all heard he was warm-hearted and he loved a good cuddle. If I was needing to talk through a project idea or something, it was always Dad that I'd ask, and he had great ideas. I loved his lovely, warm, calm voice, his resonant voice. It always made me feel calm and secure. Big, freckly, warm hands to hold when mine were cold. I'm going to read our older brother sent us something. I hope I can hold it together. Doesn't matter whether you've trained to be an actor. I'm going to miss you, Dad. Our time together was always a joy, so stimulating, full of questioning and play. You had to bring your game, a bit of sparring, but mostly lots of laughter. When we saw you in Sydney, Paris and I knew that it would be the last time. So pushing you through the streets in your wheelchair, cracking jokes at your expense, searching for art and checking out the buildings was a bittersweet and intense experience, to be sure. Have as many vivid memories as you can, was his advice to me once. And this I will cherish forever. I hope you had a chance to listen to the Jerry Lee Lewis CD I gave you. Nothing wrong with a bit of nostalgia. When you said you'd seen him at 22, I imagined the impact he must have had on you. Free and wild, full of energy and hardworking, just like you. I love you so much, Dad, and I already miss you like crazy. Old man, you are still my hero and greatest inspiration.
Thanks, Chipolata Sausage. It was good hearing from Harold Bomberg as well. I'm Digby Fortescue, by the way. Dad had names for all of us. I'm still a bit messy as well, by the way. We all know he was a humourer. He had a humour, Dad, and he had a warmth. But he was also hell of serious about a few things. He was hell of a serious about art and architecture, and he regarded it as a high art to form cultures and to really enliven and bring the world into a better place. And for me, everybody took something from David, their relationship with David, and I mean all of those things that have been spoken about before, of course. Particular thing I took from Dad was about, you know, the art of making and the craft of making and the part of culture and architecture that offers. Right at the earliest days, I remember making the batch at the Wade, and I have very vivid memories of laying out or watching him lay out the foundations. And I remember right to the very top where he crowned the whole edifice in half a corrugated iron water tank. And I wondered where he got that inspiration for that building from. And he used to tell me when I was a bit older, you should read Predicament. It's a really good book, Ronald Hugh Morrison. And I found that book and I read it and finally realised there was a tower that some nutter had built out for his aunt or something like that. Anyway, the other thing was, you know, making things was Pat Hanley. I remember really clearly he used to make these kites, sort of diaphanous kites that fly, you know, in Windmill Park and in Albert Park, and sort of almost a precursor to the kite days in the 70s. And I remember my first bicycle. We didn't go around the corner to the local bike shop. Dad put the trailer on the back of the car and we drove around a few blocks of Mount Eden while the inorganic rubbish collection was on, and got together a bike that he so accurately described as the bone shaker. He always had a good name for just about anything, didn't he, Rattles? You know, there was not really any hierarchy of materials for David in a funny way. He believed that you could build something out of sticks or tin or even dung just as well as you could do it out of travertine, brass or copper. But the key thing was that you had to really get into the essence of what the material was about and how it performed structurally and really drive it. So if you put up some sticks and you needed some bracing, you had to embrace the brace and get a symphony going out of it. We really enjoyed working together building the Hecky Street house with Johnny's brother Robert Hancock, and when I was 20 or so, and of course he did the usual wonderful thing with a building pencil on a bit of 4x2 and figuring out the details and talking about it. And he had us built. He was working with us on it in the weekends when he could. And there was another bit of 4x2 as well. When I turned 21, I went to the house to work. Got there in the morning, and there was a bit of 4x2 on the bench, and it had a pencil drawing of a key on it, a big old-fashioned key. It said, "Happy birthday, Digby. Welcome to manhood." And that was it. I think that's all I got from my 21st birthday, but it was enough. It was enough.
What about the leather waistcoat?
And we used to do things in the office too, of course, later. Cut up cardboard models and make things out of with foam board and sellotape. And we've got the house at Narrow Neck at the office, still a big foam board thing that's all been tortured and ripped and torn and cut and measured and things. But one of the loveliest things for me was, of course, working with him and the team on the Venice Biennale project, and making the exhibition really, and putting it together and prototyping it and making the tower, the wooden tower. Might be a photo of it later. In the office and out the back of the house and all of that stuff. And it was a great enriching experience, there's no question about that. Just recently, we moved our office to Devonport and we changed our name. It's Mitchell Stout Dodd now, and my delightful and lovely partner Rachel Dodd has joined us. So we've got a new business card. They arrived yesterday. So David's cards just arrived yesterday, Mitchell Stout Dodd, and we'll put them on the shelf above his drawing board in the sun and think about them. Thank you very much.
Te he Māori ora, it's May Day, and those who incline to the left know that May Day is the day when you celebrate work and workers. And it's pretty appropriate because Dave's work was a fundamentally important part of what he was. But May Day is also an international signal of distress, and I think we feel that too when we contemplate the loss of someone who was so important to so many of us. I've been asked to talk about Dave Mitchell, the architect. How long have you got? But if we're going to talk about Dave as an architect, we have to talk under many headings. There's the writer, there's the educator, there's the man who conceived of and produced wonderful buildings, and there's the person who, in all of those things and in others, was an advocate for architecture. As a writer, well, you know this book, The Elegant Shed. Still the best general survey history of New Zealand architecture after the Second World War, even though it finishes in 1984 when it was published. It wasn't long ago that we thought about reprinting it. It's pretty hard to get hold of a copy now. And maybe updating it with some new chapters by Dave. We didn't do that, but it's a pity. It would have been a great project. Dave was a great critic of architecture too, and anything he wrote about architecture had a kind of fluency and a validity that was inescapable to anybody who might have read it. As an educator, you've heard about the Brick Studio, that kind of somewhat anarchic model of architectural education that Dave, Mike Austin and others put together, really as a challenge to the orthodoxy of conventional architectural education. A wonderful experiment that perhaps we could do worse than see continued now. Dave taught at the University of Auckland School of Architecture for many years. He taught at Unitec, and Dave and Julie and I taught in China. And I can tell you, teaching with Dave was just a whole lot of fun, both in the classroom and out of it. But of course, you didn't have to be a student to be educated in architecture by Dave Mitchell. Being in his company, looking at his buildings, hearing him talk, even for experienced practitioners, was something of an education. As for the buildings, obviously there's no time here to talk about them. So I'll only talk in a personal sense. My wife Penny Sender said that a photograph of the first Gibbs house was what made her aware that architecture could be wonderful. That's before I knew her, but even if it hadn't have been, I'd have been happy to defer to Dave as the person who could turn on the light about what architecture can be. Every one of the projects he did with Jack Manning, with Julie Mitchell or with others, had that, Julie Stout, sorry, had that capacity to make you aware of what architecture can do. There's the music school, about which all I will say is I note that it had a library. And of course, for me, there's Te Uru, which I drive past every day, and it's just such a delight to see there's some real architecture in Te Tarangi. As a promoter of architecture, Julian mentioned the Venice Architecture Biennale. Dave was the creative director of New Zealand's first entry into the Venice Architecture Biennale. And although he was really not much of a friend to theory, he was eminently capable of stringing together a coherent narrative. And the one he promoted in the exhibition in Venice was that the architecture of Aotearoa New Zealand is a fusion, a synthesis of the Pacific and the West. It's an extremely compelling proposition, especially when illustrated as Dave and his team illustrated it so well with numerous buildings. He was wonderful to work with. His attitude to the NZAA was perhaps a little bit like his attitude towards the university when he ran the Brick Studio. He was somewhat impatient of institutions and bureaucracies. And you might say he warmed to the NZAA as he aged. You might say his attitude was rather like that of G.M. Trevelyan, who, when asked whether he was a pillar of the church, said that he was more of a flying buttress and that he supported it from the outside. No flying buttresses in this building, I'm sorry, but Dave could no doubt have proposed some if they ever wanted to remodel the building. He was a totally collegial man, and there are some people although this building's full, some people not here today who had a few words to say. Pete Bosley, Pip Cheshire, Lindy Naismith and others are in Brazil, and they've written this to be read. We've all been significantly influenced by David as a teacher, a mentor, an inspiration, a close friend, a confidant. We've shared memorable portions of our lives with him and Julie, and are extremely sad to be so far from you all. We send our love and thoughts to all, and especially Julie and the family. We miss David, and we miss you all very much. I think we all feel that. I'll simply conclude by saying that Dave had a profound effect on architecture in New Zealand and on anybody who practices it or is interested in it. He was an extraordinary man, he was an extraordinary architect, and like pretty well everyone else here, I feel immensely privileged to have known him as a model and as a friend.
I always have to do that. Especially when I was in the company of Donaldson, Mitchell and Smythe. I didn't actually get to know David until the early 70s, introduced by Roger Donaldson. So we'd all go out to the Kiwi or somewhere, and there'd be Donaldson and Mitchell and Smythe. I was always invisible. I thought of them as the Three Musketeers. They were a very tight group, those three. So I'm pleased to have the opportunity to represent Roger and Ellen, and from Roger some memories about my lifelong friend, David. The phone rang yesterday and I ran to the bedroom to pick up the call before it stopped. A voice said, "It's Julie here." Then a pause, and then she said, "David has died." Those words hit like a sledgehammer. It's not possible. I was speaking with him just a week ago. He admitted that he had felt better, but assured me that everything was okay. That lovely big infectious laugh of his gave me confidence that everything would be fine, and that I'd see him at the end of May. I felt crushed. Over 50 years of friendship ended with those three words: David has died. I met David over 50 years ago. There was a Saturday afternoon party at his house on Hepburn Street in Freeman's Bay. I remember that day like it was yesterday. David answered the door. In the hallway was little Ben. I remember his bright red hair and nappies that needed changing. From that day on, we became close friends. I was starting out on my film career, and David was a budding young architect. Every Friday night after work, we'd meet up at the Kiwi on Upper Simon Street, get pissed, talk about the things we were going to do with our lives and about how we were going to set the world on fire. Some of you might remember David had a big, long, bushy, red beard. He looked like a very convincing hippie. One of the earliest of my films was called Start Again. It was about alternative lifestyles. David wasn't shy about being in front of the camera, so it wasn't too difficult to convince him to play the part of a totally committed hippie hard at work, tilling the earth with his hoe. Yes, he did a very convincing impersonation of a hippie, as he sent the dirt flying with his hoe, preparing the earth for a crop of phantom veggies. The hippie thing seemed to stick, though, and we became part of the Mohawk community at Sandy Bay on the Coromandel. However, we soon came to the realization that the life of the hippie farmer was not what we were cut out for. Around this time, I bought a house in Freeman's Bay on Collingwood Street. David helped Sue and me get the place livable. Everyone, other than David, was very negative about this property. But David saw the potential of a house located in the inner city. He encouraged us and helped to get the place habitable. Years later, David and Julie built an amazing house just around the corner from this Collingwood Street house on Hecke Street. David was part of my earliest efforts at making movies. Ian Mune, Mitchell and I set out to write and make a film about a man's midlife crisis. We were all in the process of turning 30 at the time. All quite determined we were going through a midlife crisis. I do have to tell you that I was having a bit of a midlife crisis at the time, true. I was on my own and rented accommodation, and there was no furniture, and on the mantelpiece was a jar of Marmite, a bottle, we used to have milk in bottles in those days, of milk where the milk had separated completely into white solids on the top and clear liquid on the bottom. And at the far end of the mantelpiece, a screwed up pair of underpants. As you can imagine, I was feeling quite sorry for myself. Roger was being sympathetic, and bloody Mitchell just laughed. And that's how Derek, the film we all made together, became a comedy. So we sat around, I'm back to Roger now, we sat around and concocted a plot for our story, borrowed some equipment from a friend, and then set about making our film in a very short time. The film got to play on TV and caused quite a stir. Morals campaigner Patricia Bartlett took a major dislike to our raunchy tale, and there were scathing letters to the editors of newspapers and magazines about the poor moral characters of the people who made this piece of lowbrow entertainment. The film was called Derek. Mune played the character of Derek. I filmed it, and David, Mune and I wrote the script. Around this time, I did some adventure films with Ed Hillary. David came along on two of them as the sound man. I don't remember how he managed to get away from his job or how he persuaded his family that he should come along on these extraordinary trips. One of the films was to revisit Everest 21 years after Ed had climbed the peak, and the other was a sailing expedition around Cape Horn at the bottom of South America. Days before we were to go to Santiago, there was a violent coup. Pinochet overthrew the democratically elected Allende. Ed was told by the New Zealand government that he should not go, as the Pinochet junta was going to use Ed's visit for propaganda purposes, to be used to legitimise the government overthrow. So Ed didn't go, but of course, the rest of us did. We were picked up at the airport by the New Zealand ambassador. He showed us around the city, and there was lots of evidence of the violence that had taken place. So David and I were staying at Santiago Hilton on the outskirts of the city. At 6 p.m. there was a curfew, and very soon after, much gunfire started in the hills surrounding the hotel. David and I were sharing a room, and it was a hot night. We'd opened the windows before the curfew started to let some cool air into the room. The sound of the gunfire grew more and more intense as the evening wore on. It was clear to us that if we hoped to get any sleep, we had to shut the windows. I don't remember how it was decided, but it was decided that David would shut them. All I remember is him crawling across the floor in nothing but his undies, keeping as much of himself out of the line of fire should stray bullets come his way, and successfully closing the windows. But it became clear to me in that one heroic move that Dave was no scaredy cat, and I was. There was no way I was going to shut those windows. To cut a long story short, we safely made it around Cape Horn, but not without lots of dramas. In one bad storm, we nearly finished up shipwrecked on the rocky shore of Tierra del Fuego. When we got back home, I realised I had no desire to go sailing further than Waiheke. But David had got a taste for adventure on the high seas, and life would never be the same for him again. Lucky for him, he teamed up with his soulmate Julie, and the two of them set off on some truly epic sailing adventures together in a boat that most sailors would think twice about cruising to Great Barrier in. I can tell stories all night and day about my friendship with David, but I'm sure there's lots of other people here today that have stories to tell about how David enriched their lives as much as he enriched mine. It's impossible to say what true friendship is. All I know is that every time I saw you, David, I was stimulated by your company and your ideas. We always saw the world through the same eyes. I will miss you so much, David. Oh, how I will miss that big, infectious laugh of yours and your lovely, self-deprecating sense of humour. Those smart, pithy, no-nonsense comments about politics, art, architecture, food, wine. Those insightful observations about the opposite sex, family, friendship, longevity, and illness. I never once heard you complain. I finally realised you were seriously ill the last time I saw you, and you said to me, I'm fucked, Rog. I'm fucked. And that was followed by a big, fat, raucous belly laugh. Mitchell, You will always be in my memories. Your mate Roger.
Thank you, you guys. That was the one instruction David left. Not me. As Emmylou said to Graham, well, you've really got me this time. We've done some really scary things together, David and I, but boy, this is the scariest. You're always saying that life is not a dress rehearsal, and I now realise neither's death. I really wish you'd sorted out your funeral before you slipped away. It's so hard to put down words or get pictures together without having David's voice ringing out. Too sentimental. Oh, that's banal. No, it doesn't say anything. Or omit needless words. And with so many memories to capture and pictures, like, where's that lovely picture of Marshall and David in Paris? Or the lovely one with Jen. And I'm mortified that I left out a whole bit of the Himalayan photos. And all I can suggest is you come back next week when I've got it together, okay? And I know David would just say too many photos. David did actually believe that there were too many photos in the world. Just need one good photo. He believed in the John Scott School of Presentation. And it really should be David here giving one of his fabulous spiels. I nearly put videos of him up talking. I'm thinking, well, that would be a bit more fun. David and I were together for 37 years. And that was 24/7, I assure you. So I reckon I've clocked up about 74 years in real time. And how lucky was I? One of us would suggest something like, what about, we could sail around the world, no sweat, and off we'd go. And I'd really like to thank all of those who helped us in our dreams, because, man, we couldn't have done it without you. And how lucky I was to work with David and his lovely mind. He had a subtle, layered, nuanced view that he brought to everything, especially his architecture. His creativity was often completely left field and surprising, always searching for the driving idea, the essential form, just to get it right. He was endlessly drawing, always looking and commenting. And as we say in architecture, he had a beautiful eye. I think he had a lot of beautiful things, actually. Beautiful hands. His inventiveness, the love of the special detail, is abounding in his building. I mean, for example, the Te Uru upper floor, the lantern, was something that David just sort of came from left field again with that one and said, what if we just did that? And he went and bought a Chinese lantern and cut it in half and said, it could be something like this. And I thought, really? But he stuck in there and it happened. And what a fabulous space. And one of the great pleasures was to go there and see a concert with From Scratch just recently and see how fabulously they played music in the building and played the building. I mean, what a compliment. Oh, and how lucky am I to share the great happiness he got from his family, especially Ben, Tessa and Jules, my family. He was so tender looking after my mother and jollying her along, especially hauling them away for weekends sailing, for fishing and fun. And how he enjoyed people. I'm sure most of you are here because David took any opportunity to rave his head off. Still, he'd be truly stunned to see you all here today, and I think you would have reduced him to tears. I know you'll each have your stories, but I'm sorry we don't have any time. And I'd like to thank you all for coming. And some have come here from a long way. Rick and Karen from Sydney, Tone Wheeler from Sydney, Gillian and Les from Melbourne, Tony got you, and Pick and Diane and John McKinnon from Nelson, and the Sharp family from down south. I'm sure there are others who've done so. I can see you there, yeah. And thank you to all the dear friends and family for your support over the last few weeks. The messages, the flowers, the food, the wine, and the hugs, especially the hugs. It's been very calming for me to have you all come and call in on and sit around David lying in state with me. It's just great to be quiet with him. And about now, I can hear David say, that's enough, Stouty. You can all bugger off now. So I'd just like to say goodbye, my darling. I treasure every second that we had together, and I'll miss deeply your wit and your wisdom, your generous spirit, and most of all, your lovely laugh. Thank you.
There's a wonderful Indian poet, Rabindranath Tagore, and he said, "I have got my leave. Bid me farewell, my brothers and sisters. I bow to you all and take my departure. Here I give back the keys of my door, and I give up all claims to my house. I only ask for last kind words from you." And I think this afternoon we've had a lot of kind words said about David, and I think he might be very happy. Now, I wanted to read this piece, which I think is so David, and it's written by Hilaire Belloc, who was the very famous Anglo-French writer from the early part of the 20th century, and he was, of course, a great sailor. It is called On Dropping Anchor. The best noise in all the world is the rattle of the anchor chain when one comes into harbour at last and lets it go over the bows. I love to consider a place which I have never yet seen, but which I shall reach at last, full of repose and marking the end of those voyages and security from the tumble of the sea. The place will be a cove set round with high hills, on which there shall be no house or sign of men, and it shall be enfolded by quite deserted land. But the westering sun will shine pleasantly upon it under a warm air. It will be a proper place for sleep. The fairway into that haven shall lie behind a pleasant little beach of shingle, which shall run out into the sea from the steep hillside, and shall be a breakwater made by God. The tide shall run up behind it smoothly and in a silent way, filling the quiet hollow of the hills, brimming it all up like a cup of refreshment and of quiet, a cup of ending. Then with what pleasure shall I put my small boat round, just round the point of that shingle beach, noting the shoal water by the eddies and the deeps by the blue colour of them, where the channel runs from the main into the fairway. Up that fairway shall I go, up into the cove, and the gates of it shall shut behind me, headland against headland, so that I shall not see the open sea any more, though I shall hear its distant noise. But all around me, save for that distant echo of the surf from the high hills, will be silence, and the evening will be gathering already. Under that falling light, all alone in such a place, I shall let go the anchor chain and let it rattle for the last time. My anchor will go down into the clear salt water with a run, and when it touches, I shall pay out 4 lengths or more, so that she may swing easily and not drag. And then I shall tie up my canvas and fasten all for the night and get me ready for sleep. And that will be the end of my sailing. Now, could you please all stand for the committal?